Any genuine Ouija stories? My cousin and I years ago used a homemade Ouija board at her house. We asked random questions, and I tried to ask for my nan who passed many years before. I asked questions only my nan would know, so I knew my cousin wasn't pushing the coin. All questions were answered correctly. Satisfied, we closed the board and finished the game. That night, I could not sleep, and when I opened my eyes, a little girl was standing at the end of the bed. My younger cousin, who was not there when we did the board, continued to see this girl for weeks afterwards. Not me personally, but my boss at my previous job discussed this story with me and some other coworkers a few times over my time working there. She is really serious about not letting her kids use them and tells others not to as well. She was 13 and at a friend's house just hanging out. They went to friend's room and started playing with one. The first few times they had ever used it, nothing happened, but the last time they ever used it, they ended up contacting something. It supposedly started moving around on its own, and after a few questions, I can't remember exacts, it eventually led to, someone will die in your household with a name beginning with L, which would have only been the friend's older sister. They were freaked out, but as kids, brushed it off as just something creepy. The next day, the sister was hit by a car and died. You could see the terror as she described it to us. I refused to use a Ouija board after hearing her discuss this. Still gives me chills. My mom played with one with this girl I will call Cindy. Cindy had one and tarot cards. One night she spent the night at Cindy's and they played it. She can't remember what was asked or answered, but did remember it moved. She was convinced Cindy was moving it. Late that night, Cindy sat straight up in her bed and said in a deep voice, "I am possessed." It scared my mom because she was 9, and this was in 1967. Things like that were odd in those days, and there were no horror movies to desensitize people. She never spent the night with her again. Cindy ended up joining a satanic cult in college, came back to visit one weekend, and told my mom and their mutual friends about how her boyfriend and his cult were following her. 3 years later, she committed suicide. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia a few months before, and doctors believed it was a bad reaction to the psyche meds that drove her to suicide. My stepmother used a board in the 80s with a bunch of her girlfriends, and the next morning, one girl woke up with an upside-down cross burned into her leg. It's still visible to this day. Ada. I have never touched a board because of these stories, and I never will. Too much fear, and it feeds off of fear. This story was told to me by my father. My aunt, his younger sister, had lost a friend when she was about 13 years old. The friend had died in a car accident, and it was overall just a very tragic loss of a young life. Shortly after her friend's death, my aunt went to a sleepaway camp. It was one of those huge ones that have a couple hundred kids come to from all over the state. One night while there, my aunt's cabin mates pulled out a Ouija board. My aunt was always scared of horror-style stuff and didn't want to play. It's important to note that these cabin mates at the time were people she met at the camp and who did not know my aunt nor her friend who had passed away. As they began to play, my aunt stayed in her bunk and tried to keep herself preoccupied. The group playing eventually got to asking who they were talking to when they got my aunt's friend's name. Not too crazy, since the name is common. Whatever, my aunt shook it off. The group kept playing and they asked her how she died, and the planchette spelled out car. That was enough for my aunt. It freaked her the fleab out, and she immediately told her family when she got back. It's not too wild of a story, but it was pretty freaky considering how close it was to the accident and how no one else in the room was local enough to know about the accident and my aunt's friend's passing. When I was 12, a few girlfriends and I were using a Ouija board while hanging out at my best friend's house. We asked a bunch of questions that I don't really remember the answers to, except for the fact that the board said one girl would die from murder. She is still alive today. The story I am about to tell you is what I will never forget. When it came time for us to ask questions about me, I asked who I would marry, how many kids I would have, how I would die and when. The board spelled out a guy's name that I did not know and said I would marry him and have 2 boys. My best friend scoffed, "Yeah, right. Give us his phone number." We laughed, but it spelled out the number. It was in our local area code. So, she wrote the number down on a piece of paper, grabbed the phone, and called it. This was years before cell phones. We all crowded around the handset to listen. A woman answered and my friend asked for the guy by name. A sweet-sounding woman on the phone said he wasn't home and asked if my friend wanted to leave a message. We all freaked out and my friend slammed the phone down. We were giggling and freaking out at this crazy coincidence, as young girls are apt to do. The board also said I would die of fever at 74. We all thought that was weird too. I remember 12-year-old me thinking, who dies of a fever? Dumb, but that is what I thought. I don't remember much else about what happened with the board that day beyond that, as what happened afterwards overshadowed everything else. Weird things started happening in my best friend's house when I was over, and they were really frightening. I won't go into it here, but it was really dark, and we knew we had messed up by playing with that board. Fast forward 2 years later. I start dating my first real boyfriend. His name was the same as the name of the guy the board said I would marry. Coincidence, right? Wrong. When my best friend was packing up to move, she found the piece of notebook paper in the box with the Ouija board. It was my boyfriend's number, they were not friends. There is no way she could have known it, written it down, and played it off. We were both freaked out. I told my boyfriend, we had been dating about a year at this point, and we told his mom about it. She said she remembered a weird call from a couple years back where girls were giggling and hung up. This coincidence bothered her badly, and I wish we never told her. She was a very religious preschool teacher with a sweet voice. Great lady. I did not marry him. We dated for years, and I really thought we would get married, but I broke it off and moved away during a difficult time in my life. He eventually married someone else, with whom he has 2 sons. I never had children. Ouija boards are bad news. I don't know how or why they work, and some of the answers were off in my case, but what was correct and the weird things that happened in my friend's house after bother me sometimes, even 25 years later. I would never, ever touch one again. I've never really talked about it with anyone because it sounds insane. I guess I can, though. The night after the Ouija board stuff, we were standing and talking in my best friend's kitchen. A metal container they kept tea in came flying out of a top cabinet and crashed to the floor. The thing flew out of a closed cabinet. We were terrified. Not long after, I saw what I can only describe as a ghost or spirit walk past a doorway on the first level of my friend's house. I was about to head up the stairs and I looked to my right. A woman with dark hair, in a floor-length white nightgown dress, walked by the doorway, like from one side of the room to the other, only she would have had to walk through a built-in bookcase in the room she was in, and that was impossible. I froze and it took me a minute to process what I had seen. Then I ran up the stairs and told my best friend. She disclosed that she had been having dreams about a woman who looked like the one I saw. She appeared visibly upset and shaken. She had never mentioned these dreams to me before that moment. I have no way of knowing whether she was telling the truth or not, but I never knew her to lie. We would hear noises in the house, banging and tapping. It felt very heavy and dark. It's hard to explain the feeling, but you could feel it. Keys went missing. Her parents started to fight a lot and divorced not long after. I started getting weird hang-up calls at my house with static in the background. My whole demeanor changed. I went from a straight-A student who dressed in preppy clothes to wearing all black, listening to heavy metal, and doing poorly in my classes. My best friend became involved in the occult, but I steered clear of going that far. My life went from really stable to chaotic almost overnight, with the line being the day we played with that Ouija board. I came out of that phase, but she got deeper into it. Over the next few years, we grew further and further apart. I don't talk about it now because it sounds so unreal and because of the darkness surrounding that time. Yet, this shared experience happened to us. I focus on the light now and have for a long time. There are dark things beyond our understanding that are very dangerous. It is best to leave them alone. Once my uncle told me a time he and his friends played with a Ouija board at his friend's house. There were 5 of them including my uncle. Mind you, this was during the 80s when he was a teenager. One of his friends brought a Ouija board over and skeptical, they went downstairs into the basement to play it. The basement walls had mirrors lined on both sides. None of them believed in the paranormal, so they were taking everything pretty lightly. They turned off the lights and started asking stupid questions like, what color of underwear am I wearing? What time is it? Where you are? And the likes. After a good 30 minutes or so, they start to get bored since there were no answers coming through. My uncle was about to remove his hand and go back upstairs until one of his friends asked, is heaven and hell real? Have you seen God? Jokingly. Then he recalls hearing some sort of static and the planchette begins to move, and at this point, everyone starts flipping out and laughing nervously. The planchette begins moving on random numbers. My uncle doesn't recall what those numbers were, but he remembers there were a lot of zeros. The planchette was jerking really fast, and everyone was confused as the person next to them because they knew there was no way someone in the group was moving the planchette so fast and randomly. "Guys, stop! Guys, stop!" one of his friends yelled. Everyone took their hands off, and the planchette stopped for a brief moment and glided over to the letter Z. Everyone was frozen and didn't really know what to do. My uncle said he had so much adrenaline that he freaked out and yelled, "Whoever you are, I'm not scared of you." Suddenly, there was a loud bang in the wall behind him, and the light began to flicker like crazy. He turned his attention to the mirrors on the walls and saw what looked like a really large mangled dog with a huge mouth and burning red eyes in one of the mirrors for what he said was like a split second. It was clear as day, and it struck so much fear into my uncle that he developed a really bad fear of big dogs when he used to love them as a kid. He screamed and everyone just ran like heck up the stairs. There was a loud crash, and my uncle closed the basement door and locked it as soon as everyone was out. The next morning, his parents inspected and one of the mirrors was smashed but still intact, and the light bulb had exploded. His friend's parents were pissed, especially when they found the board. He never told his friends what he saw down there until they were out of college. My uncle doesn't scare easily even when he was young. He always tried to be the guy with the biggest balls. The macho alpha, he would call it. Even today, he has this look on his face every time he tells this story. It's really unlike my uncle to get so serious when he is usually a pretty laid-back humorous guy.